Hello there and welcome to this game review. So this was quite a long game with quite an interesting endgame, which could have gone both ways. So let's get down to it. So d4, d5, so obviously what white is doing here is stupid, just wasting time, and black can take the center. Now, after queen d4, queen d1, then black is even better, and most likely we will get some kind of queen's gambit accepted type of position, where white has lost a lot of time, so black should be slightly better in this symmetrical position. So knight f3, and eventually this happened, and a6, so this is kind of the correct way to develop. And b6 is a bit faster, but it doesn't really matter, a6 is fine. b5, bishop a2, and here all the pieces are developed, so now we have to do something productive. And in these positions, well, and as always in all positions, we must look for weak squares, right? And the weak squares are over here, mostly. And in this position, everything is symmetrical, but as you mentioned, the rooks are more active, and this can be to your benefit. And we must get our knight to c4. If this happens, we can take the opponent's bishop pair, which would be somewhat of an advantage in the long term. Or the knight will stay on c4 and be extremely powerful. So for this, a move such as knight b8 makes sense. Also, the knight is generally misplaced on c6, as it's not really attacking anything, and it's blocking our bishop. So generally it should be on d7 if possible, but so now we can remaneuver it. And from there I can go to b6 and c4. And we can afford this because all of our other pieces are developed, so now we can start moving around the same pieces twice. So knight e5 instead, this is possible as well to make some kind of progress. After knight e4, this knight turns out to be a bit loose. Turns out also black has tactics related to these bishops, and well, we put our rooks here not for no reason, right? And as you pointed out, there is a tactic here with rook c2, which ends in a4. And the black will get the bishop pair, as well as an extra pawn. So, of course, we must always look for tactics, as this is what decides games. Instead bishop d6, but this move completely doesn't make sense, because you're just giving up the bishop in one move. This is very hard to understand why we are giving the opponent an advantage, a clear advantage, which is the bishop pair, so easily, right? The knight is over here, and now we are just asking the opponent to get the bishop pair. This is extremely strange, and we should think about why we made this move. Hopefully this does not repeat itself. Otherwise, there are other moves as well, mostly related to the weak squares on c4 and a4 as well. Knight b6 can be played, trying to get a knight to these squares. Or the general plan is usually to play f6, to block this bishop and to block all the opponent's knights. The king can go to f7, later we can play e5 to further gain space, take away the d4 square. The king can even go to e6 at some point, and these are some moves that slightly improve the position. But bishop d6 just is horrible. Okay, rook d1, and now the bishop correctly moves back. Knight d4, and this again tactically doesn't work, mostly because of this hanging knight. So knight takes d4 is correct. And here, white should recapture with the pawn, the bishop. And here, black can win a pawn. I'm not sure if you saw this one. And here, knight takes e3, a discovered attack on this knight. Black ends up being a pawn ahead. And rook takes d4 turns out to be even worse. Not to mention black can just do exactly the same thing here, which is again strange to not see because you mentioned this, right? And here if white recaptures, then we will take and take, and again we have won a pawn for nothing. And instead, rook c2 is even stronger, it turns out. And you didn't really analyze the main line, which would be rook d2, which makes sense to not lose the bishops instantly. But now after taking, again the same thing, knight takes e3, knight is hanging, and it turns out white is losing a lot of material here, because after this not only have we won a pawn, this is also a fork. So a lot of tactics are missed here, and I think for this to change, you must consciously look for tactics in every single game that you play. As you don't really get to choose when tactics happen, right? They happen on the board, and you must be there to use them. Right? So knight f6, but this is very kind of simple. This gives white no questions, And generally, it's hard to understand why we're even moving this knight, right? As we have so many moves forward. Even if rook c2 didn't win a piece, this is just a move that improves the rook, gets the rook to the second rank. You can make this move without any calculation and figure it out as it goes. Knight f6 kind of doesn't make any sense as you're just exchanging pieces. So okay, knight f6, rook d8, rook d8, and you called this a mistake. And you said this was the critical point because this was the wrong recapture, and you consider you're bothered more by this than the previous blunder. But this is a very strange thing about your mindset, as this has basically nothing to do with the result of the game. And this small inaccuracy of allowing the opponent to slightly ruin your structure, this doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things. This is something that you must understand, that this is completely inconsequential compared to all the other blunders in this game. So this is not something that should bother you. What should bother you is this moment, right? This is where you must think, how could this never repeat itself ever again, right? Rook c2 must be found. But here, I don't know, bishop d8 is possible. There's nothing wrong with this. It has its minuses as well. For example, rook d1. The opponent might be first to the second rank, as it seems your bishop is a bit misplaced. Objectively, this is all fine, but okay, rook d8, bishop f6, g takes f, and yeah, the pawns are split, and in a pawn endgame this would be bad, because the opponent's king can go take this pawn. In other endgames, it's also slightly bad, but it's not the end of the world. After rook d1, you played rook takes d1, and you mentioned you thought this buys you a tempo, which it does, and it allows you to activate your king, but there's not really a place to activate your king, right? When you think about a king, what can it do? It can go to d6. It can even go to e5 if allowed, but from there it can't really go anywhere, right? There's no real way to break through with the king, so this tempo doesn't really matter. And the question of whether or not you should exchange rooks is a very serious question. And for this we have to understand that the closer we get to a pawn endgame, the worse it will be. Bishop endgames are also quite bad for black, because the pawns here are fixed on light squares, which means they are targets if the bishop ever gets here, which happened in the game. White is winning, while these ones can never be attacked. Also, the pawns on f7 and h7 are also on light squares, so the rook endgame must be avoided at all costs. I mean the bishop endgame, right? So rook c8 makes sense to keep the rooks on the board. Black has a simple plan of going here, or simply rook c3 and taking the pawn. It cannot get much more simple than this, right? Of course, rook d7 has to be calculated. Bishop d5, bishop h5. Black is losing a pawn over here, but it's not the end of the world, as black's pieces are very active. He can take both of these pawns, and surely black will have enough counterplay to not lose this game. But in a bishop endgame, this one tempo that you win is really not consequential. There was a very big question of whether or not to exchange rooks, and unfortunately this time you chose wrong. So rook d1 and king f8, the king can arrive, and it turns out black should have played f5 at all times, basically to stop the opponent from playing e4. Of course, this is not terribly intuitive, but it seems this is the way to play, as the king can also go to f6, and white's only kind of plan is actually to bring the king to attack this pawn, which is something we must think about. So okay, king e7, h6, so this is given an inaccuracy, but this is basically because it allows white to play e4, and the reason e4 is so important is that it kind of fixes these two weaknesses. This means black will always be tied to this pawn, and the white can potentially at some point go here with the bishop, so f5 is unplayable now because it will always leave numerous weaknesses, which means f6 will not be playable as well. Of course, it doesn't really make sense to put pawns on light squares, but in this case the bishop is very dominated and it gives the king a path towards c5. If the king gets here, white is more or less winning. So for example, e5, bishop b3, the bishop can go to e6, and it's kind of fine. Pawn endgames should be kind of fine because black has only one weakness and he can go here with the king. Okay, king f2, e5, which again makes sense. But here it turns out black is dominated after bishop f5 because he can never allow the move bishop c8. This means this bishop cannot move at all. So from here, white has the freedom to do whatever he wants. Mostly he should go here with his king and attack the pawn on h6, and from there play for Zugzwang. For example, let's say we get this position. Now notice this bishop cannot move because of bishop c8, and this king cannot move because of this. So I can play something like h4, and black is going to lose the pawn on a6 because he cannot move the king or the bishop. And this is usually how these endgames are won, and they're won because the pawns are on light squares. So instead e4 was played, bishop c8 and g4. But this is very bad by white because now he, for one thing, loses all of his waiting moves. Because now if the king goes to h4, he cannot move the pawns in any way without exchanging them. Also, this bishop cannot really do anything now after bishop e6. This is the only kind of diagonal for the bishop. And black is supposed to be fine here, king e3. But here we must understand that the queen side is just completely blocked. If there's a pawn endgame, with these two pawns, white can never break through in any way. Even f4 doesn't do anything because black does not have to react. So here, the simplest way to draw would be to activate the bishop with bishop c4, hinting at bishop f1 as well. And if white plays h4, then the white king will not have the opportunity to go towards this pawn anymore. So this is kind of a dead draw at this point. After this is probably simplest. h4, bishop c4. If we get the pawn endgame, we can just say okay, and there's not really much to do here. We can just move around here, and white cannot win because of these two pawns. So instead, king b6 and king c6, and you mentioned the idea of king b6 and a5, possibly getting a passed pawn, but getting a passed pawn here is impossible. I'm not really understanding how you're getting a passed pawn here, because this is not checkers, right? The pawn is not forced to take. And if you exchange here, then you will just expose the weakness on b5. After f4, white doesn't really have any threats here. If he takes, we just improve our structure. We just have to do some kind of move, right? But bishop c4 is a horrible blunder, and it should be quite obvious that this is losing, as you mentioned yourself. Here, black just has a weak pawn here. White just has to play a4 to not allow king b5. And from here, white will slowly just take the pawn. Easier is even take here first in a4. And the game is just over. We must not lose in such silly ways, right? Bishop c4 is an invitation to a pawn endgame, but before going to a pawn endgame, we must be completely and absolutely sure that we're doing well. And we must have calculated the important variations. But this doesn't seem calculated. And again, this wasn't provoked at all. White is not threatening anything. So instead f5, bishop b3, yeah, bishop h1, d1, but this allows the king to now go towards this weakness. Turns out black has to just go and defend g7, and this should be a dead draw. Black is in time, because there's not really much for white to do. a4 is impossible. This diagonal is taken, so this bishop can't get to a6, so there's nothing to do here. So instead, bishop d1. And also, we must understand that black has no chances of winning here, right? And this is absolutely impossible, and we must be realistic about this. Black has nothing to attack. If white wanted a draw, he can just sit and wait. But bishop d1, now this allows king h4. At this point, the only chance was h5 to try to exchange pawns. It's, for example, if here, then this should be a dead draw, as black will just put the king on e7. Otherwise, if white takes, we can take. And after this, it turns out the opponent's king simply cannot advance further, and the pawn can also not advance, because we're in this diagonal. So now, king h4, and white wins the pawn on h6, and promotes this pawn, or at least he should. Though it's not that simple, he plays bishop c2, remaneuvering the bishop to a different diagonal, and at this point, white should win by Zugzwang, kind of fixing his mistake, playing bishop b1. Now it turns out black is in zugzwang. He cannot move the king. And this bishop can actually not move because it's doing two jobs, attacking this and protecting h5. If it goes here, after this, the game is over. So white did not find this, king h6, and now the king is allowed to f8. Now bishop h5, but this allows the bishop to go here. Again, the bishop had an important duty. Turns out black can just continue harassing this pawn. If the pawn goes, white cannot really make much progress, as now these are stuck. So instead, king bishop h5, bishop f3. But now the game is won for white. He can improve the h pawn and take these. And white should be, of course, winning here. But he didn't really do it in the best way. If we have two connected passed pawns, we should generally try to push them together. And here bishop e2, f5, b5. This is just in time. After this f3, we can just take it or even push further. And importantly, white is also promoting with a check. So black is not in time to promote his own pawn. But at this point, I would think the opponents don't have much time. a7 and the bishop e2, but this turns out to be one tempo too late, as mentioned. At this point, the only winning move is bishop d3, which isn't terribly obvious, as black can continue fighting with this. After b5, f5, f5, b6, and the f5, bishop a6 turns out to win. But this is not entirely obvious, and this must be calculated. There's no other way to figure this out. Said after bishop e2, black is actually first to queen the pawn, as white has lost a lot of time. And here e2, and black queens, and black wins the game. So after a very chaotic endgame, after mutual blunders by both sides, black ends up being the winner. But this is a very important endgame which must be studied by black, as these mistakes were very avoidable. Some of them were positional, but most of them were very tactical. For example, here, it's inexplicable to not play rook c2, as even if this does not win bishops, the rook belongs on the second rank. This is one of the fundamental principles of chess. So okay, so quite an interesting game. Hopefully this was useful, and see you next time.